For my pechu kapcha, I'm going to be talking about my second favorite topic, other than video games, which is alcohol. American whiskey to be exact. But before I can tell you about American whiskey, I have to tell you about whiskey itself. Whiskey is basically a grain-based spirit, mostly aged in oak barrels. Whiskey has its traditions in many countries, including Scotland and Ireland, who both fight over who first invented whiskey. They were both invented in those two countries around the same time. American whiskey is a little bit different than whiskey around the world for many different reasons. One reason being that um, we use new oak barrels instead of old barrels, and that we use different grains, which I'll get into later. America loves this whiskey. George Washington actually had the largest distillery. He was prompted to start distilling on his property at Mount Vernon by his Scottish plantation master. Um, in America, rye is easiest to produce with our type of soil, so it became a major producer for whiskey. Also, corn, which is a distinct American uh, crop. Excuse me. Early pioneers started off in Maryland and Pennsylvania, but after high taxes and uh, the Whiskey Rebellion, they fled to Kentucky, where there was very good water and fertile land. Some of the early Kentucky settlers include Elijah Pepper, who owns E&J, Jacob Bean, who owns Jim Bean, and Robert Samuels, who owns Maker's Mark. These companies are still around right now and are some of the top companies uh, in America. Bourbon uh, actually gets its name from the small town in Bourbon County. Uh, but don't say that to anybody in New Orleans, because it's a rivalry over whether it started there or Bourbon Street, New Orleans. Technically, whiskey from anywhere can be called bourbon, even though it's mostly associated with Kentucky. As long as it starts as a mash with at least 51% corn in it. Um, how a bourbon is made is traditionally from a sour mash that is distilled twice, once in a single column still, and then the hearts are distilled in a pot still. Making a sour mash involves the addition of the tails of the distillate from a prior distillation. The bourbon is then aged in new white oak barrels. It has to be aged in the barrels for at least 2 years, and to be labeled straight, it must be unblended or blended only with other straight bourbon. Tennessee whiskey is bourbon. That's right. Don't tell anybody in Tennessee I said that. But Tennessee whiskey is essentially bourbon that is distilled and aged in Tennessee. In fact, the only legal definition for Tennessee whiskey is by the NAFTA, which says that Tennessee whiskey is a straight bourbon made out of Tennessee. The only difference is that in Tennessee whiskey, that has to undergo the Lincoln County process, which involves filtering the whiskey through maple charcoal before barrel aging. It's named after the county that Jack Daniels was actually started in. While bourbon and Tennessee whiskey may be the most famous coming out of America, they are by no means the only American whiskeys. U.S. regulations actually define several classes of whiskeys coming out of America. The options are actually nearly unlimited, given that these different types of whiskey can be used for blended whiskey as well. The only regulations that um, are required is that blended whiskeys include at least 20% of the straight whiskey on a proof per gallon basis. But the rest is left up to the creative efforts of the talented master whiskey blenders. Another trend that's coming out of America right now is small batches. Small batches are used to make the whiskey more complex and exclusive and to tempt the palate more. It doesn't necessarily produce a better blend of whiskeys, but they have a more distinct flavor and style. During the early 20th century, Prohibition came about, and it actually dried up all the whiskey in Tennessee and Kentucky. Um, Afterwards, the whiskey that was coming out of them was very light and didn't have as much flavor as people were sought to come out from the harsh alcohols of the Prohibition era. Now we're getting back more into complex and balanced whiskey, um, back to more what it originally tasted like. Because uh, this is mostly driven by the bartenders who are using with bourbon and more of our drinks, such as the most classic American drinks, the Old Fashioned and the Manhattan, which both use bourbon inside of them. Little side note before I go, you may notice that whiskey is spelled two different ways often. Whiskey is with the E is for Ireland and the US, and whiskey without the E is for Scotland, Canada, and Japan. So, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you learned something about my favorite topic.